Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Settle in, get comfortable, pour yourself something warm or something cold, whatever helps you sink into that particular quiet space you find when you're ready to really listen to something. Because what we are going to explore today is not casual conversation. This is not the kind of material that gets discussed in the atriums of the administratum or mentioned casually in the corridors of any institution loyal to the Imperium of man. What we are going to look at together is the kind of knowledge that inquisitors have executed entire lineages for merely approaching. It is the kind of truth that entire orders dedicate their operational existence to suppressing, to burning, to removing from every archive and every mind that has had the misfortune of coming close to it. There are chambers beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra that the highest lords of the administratum do not know exist, not classified from them, or not above their clearance level, simply unknown to them, unregistered in any document that passes through the normal institutional channels. These chambers are sealed beneath layers of warding and cipher so dense that decoding them fully, with every necessary resource, could take several human lifetimes. Some of what sleeps in those deepest places, if it were ever brought to light, would not merely embarrass the Imperium, would not merely force an uncomfortable rethinking of certain policy positions. It would end the Imperium, not in the way that chaos ends things, through violence and corruption and the slow dissolution of everything that gives life meaning. Faster than that, more internally, the way a body ends when the thing holding it together finally gives out. Because the Imperium of man, that grinding, bleeding, magnificent, as horrifying machine that spans 1,000,000 worlds and burns 10,000 suns and devours its own children with methodical industrial efficiency, is not held together by logistics. Not really. Not by the administratum's endless columns of figures. Not by the Adeptus Mechanicus's jealously hoarded technology. Not by the military might of the Space Marine chapters, or the Astra Militarum's uncountable regiments. All of those things are real and all of those things matter. But none of them is the load-bearing structure. The Imperium is held together by a story, by the image of a golden, divine, eternal figure sitting upon a radiant throne somewhere beneath the mountains of Terra, his consciousness burning across the galaxy like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness, his will holding back the worst of what wants to consume humanity, simply through the force of his love for his species and his absolute commitment to their protection. That image is the immune system of the Imperium. It is the answer to every question about why you should keep fighting when fighting seems pointless. It is the reason a soldier on a world she has never heard of dies with the Emperor's name on her lips, rather than simply running, which any reasonable person in that situation would consider. The story is everything. Take away the story, and you do not have a lesser Imperium, a damaged Imperium, an Imperium that needs to recover and rebuild. Whereas you have a collection of competing institutions and factions and power structures with no shared foundation, turning on each other with the same ferocity they have spent millennia directing outward. This is not, I want to be clear about this from the beginning, a video about why the Emperor is bad. It is not a video designed to suggest that the Imperium would be better off without him, or that chaos would have been preferable, or that any of the available alternatives look appealing once you actually examine them. This is a video about what is true, about what the evidence scattered across decades of lore, from the earliest Rogue Trader publications through the Horus Heresy novel series and into the current 41st Millennium material, tells us about the being that billions of humans worship as a god. The truth is more complicated than the story, more human than the story, in certain ways more inspiring than the story, and in other ways so much darker than the story that the story exists specifically to prevent people from looking at it directly. Let us look at it directly. Part 1. Before the Emperor, there were the shamans, and the end of everything they were. To understand the Emperor of mankind, you cannot start with the Emperor of mankind. You have to start considerably earlier than that. Well, you have to go back past the age of strife, and the dark age of technology, and the early human stellar expansion, and the building of the first cities, and all the things we call recorded history. You have to go back to a time so deep in humanity's past that the species we are talking about would barely recognize the distant descendants who eventually populate the 41st millennium as their own kind. Around the 8th millennium before the Common Era, in the scattered tribal communities of prehistoric Earth, there was a class of individuals who were unlike their fellows in ways that had no easy explanation. They had what we would today call psychic gifts. They could sense things beyond the range of ordinary human perception. They could perceive threads of potential future through the medium of the warp, that strange and terrible parallel dimension that exists adjacent to physical reality, generated and sustained by the psychic output of every thinking creature in the galaxy. They could communicate across distances through means that defied any physical mechanism. They could sense illness and injury in ways that no training or logic could account for. We call them shamans because that is the closest term in our vocabulary, but the word undersells them considerably. These were not the spiritual leaders of isolated tribal communities operating on placebo and pattern recognition. These were genuine, literal psychic conduits, individuals who had established such a deep and harmonious relationship with the immaterial that the warp responded to their touch with something approaching cooperation. For the warp to cooperate with anything human is, in the context of the 41st millennium, almost inconceivable. The warp in its current state is a sea of carnivorous predators and howling emotional storms that devours the unprepared. That it was once different enough to treat the shamans with something like respect tells you something important about how much the universe has changed and why it changed. The shamans had one gift beyond all the others that made them uniquely valuable to humanity's development, a gift so extraordinary that even in the context of the 40k universe, with all its angels and monsters and ancient terrors, it stands out as something genuinely unusual. When they died, they came back. Not immediately, not into the same body, but the soul of a shaman, upon departing the physical body, did not simply dissolve into the currents of the warp the way ordinary human souls do, subject to whatever predators happened to be in the neighborhood. Instead, the shaman's soul would drift through the immaterial, gathering itself, accumulating the residue of its accumulated experience and psychic development, and eventually be born again into a new physical body, with all its memories, all its knowledge, all the power it had built across every previous life now available to the new incarnation from the moment of maturity. This cycle of death and rebirth meant that a shaman who survived long enough would become something extraordinary across their multiple lifetimes. Knowledge compounds. Each rebirth added new experiences, new contexts, new refinements to understanding that a single human lifetime, however brilliant, could never accumulate. A shaman who had lived through 10 incarnations had a perspective on humanity's development that spanned centuries. A shaman who had lived through 50 incarnations had something closer to the perspective of a geological feature than a person. They had seen the patterns of civilization from close enough to map them, and so these beings served as the guides and protectors of early humanity. Not gods, not rulers in any formal sense, but shepherds in the true meaning of the word, had beings who nudged and guided and redirected the species away from its worst tendencies when they could see the cliffs that ordinary human perception could not. How many plagues were avoided because a shaman sensed the disease vector and guided their people away? How many resource collapses were prevented by advice that seemed like wisdom but was actually foresight? Well, how many intertribal conflicts were quietly diffused before they could escalate into the kind of violence that could damage populations still small enough to be genuinely vulnerable to mass loss? We cannot know, precisely because the shamans were so good at their work that many of the disasters they prevented left no record. That is the nature of effective guidance. The catastrophe that does not happen is invisible. But then something began to shift in the warp, and the comfortable arrangement that had allowed the shamans to cycle through their many lives began to break down. As human civilization developed from scattered tribal communities toward the first true cities, as the species grew in population and in complexity, As empire and war and commerce and religion and ambition began to scale up to levels that smaller human communities had never reached, the psychic output of humanity grew and grew, and the quality of that psychic output changed. As the warp, which mirrors and is shaped by the emotional and psychic life of the beings whose consciousness generates it, began to reflect the darker aspects of large-scale human civilization. Rage on a mass scale, grief on a mass scale, ambition and cruelty and obsession at population-level concentrations that the early tribal period had never produced. The immaterial began to churn and deepen, and from that churning darkness, shapes began to form. But the entities that would become the four great chaos gods were not born overnight. Their development was a geological process in its own right, unfolding over millennia as the raw psychic fuel of human suffering and passion accumulated in the warp. But they were forming, growing more coherent, more powerful, more intentional. And as they grew, they took notice of the shamans, these bright, accumulated souls, cycling through their comfortable reincarnations must have looked to the hungrily forming entities in the warp's depths like something extraordinary, not just a meal, a treasure, souls saturated with hundreds of years of accumulated psychic development, fat with power in a way that ordinary human souls simply were not. The predators began to hunt them. Where once a shaman could die and drift peacefully through the currents of the immaterial until rebirth called them back into a new body, now death became a gauntlet. Or the approach of a shaman's soul in the warp attracted attention. The forming entities that would eventually be named Horn and Sench and Nurgle sent whatever consciousness they could direct toward these bright lights in the immaterial, and one by one the lights went out. Not destroyed exactly, consumed, devoured, added to the growing mass of psychic energy that was feeding the maturation of the chaos gods. Man subtracted forever from the cycle of wisdom and guidance that had protected humanity for so many thousands of years. The shamans who survived watched this process with growing terror. They could feel through their connection to the warp what was happening, could sense the disappearance of their colleagues who died and simply did not come back. They could feel the entities growing stronger with every consumed soul, and they could calculate, us with the particular clarity of beings who have spent multiple lifetimes observing patterns, exactly where this trend was heading. If nothing changed, eventually all of them would be gone, consumed, and without them, without their accumulated wisdom, without their quiet guidance, humanity would be left entirely alone in a universe that was becoming actively hostile at an accelerating rate. The warp that had once cooperated with them was becoming something else. But the Chaos Gods were not yet powerful enough to reach directly into the physical world in significant ways, but that was a matter of time, and humanity without its shamans would feed them faster, would give them exactly the kind of unguided, escalating civilization-level despair and rage and ambition that would accelerate their growth toward the point where the physical world itself would be at risk. The extinction of the shamans was not just a problem for the shamans, and it was the beginning of the end for everything. They knew this, and so they called a council. This was, by any reasonable assessment, the most important meeting in human history. Not the signing of any treaty, not the founding of any civilization, not any battle or discovery or philosophical development that our histories celebrate. The meeting of humanity's ancient shamans, gathered in a location that has been lost to time, lasting for what may have been years or centuries of debate, trying to determine whether their species could be saved, and if so, how. The problem was clearly defined. The solution was anything but. They needed to create a guardian for humanity that could survive what they could not. Something too powerful to be casually consumed by the predators of the warp. Something that could operate on a timescale long enough to actually address the threats that were forming. Something that contained within it the accumulated wisdom of all of them, or all their lifetimes and all their knowledge, rather than losing all of that to the fragmentation of death. The solution they arrived at was this. They would all die at once, deliberately, simultaneously, and their combined soul energy, so vast and overwhelming in its unified form that even the hungriest warp predator would be unable to consume it, would be directed toward a single point, a single birth. One child born to ordinary parents in an ordinary community, who would carry within him the essence of all of them, the combined psychic weight of thousands of accumulated lifetimes, compressed into a single soul capable of doing what they individually could not. They called this being they hoped to create the new man. And then they killed themselves, all of them, together, in what must have been the most extraordinary moment of mass psychic activity in all of human prehistory. Thousands of shamans scattered across the surface of old Earth drank poison simultaneously, and their souls rushed into the warp in a flood of combined energy that overwhelmed the entities waiting to devour them, burning through the darkness with a purifying light too vast for any individual predator to contain or consume. For a moment, that combined energy blazed in the immaterial like something new, like something that had not existed before in all the long history of the galaxy. And then it found its direction, its purpose, its vessel. Approximately 1 year after the great dying of the shamans, in a small farming community in the region that would one day be called Anatolia, in what we know today as Turkey, a child was born to ordinary parents who had no idea what they were bringing into the world. The child was physically unremarkable, a boy, brown-haired perhaps, growing up among siblings and neighbors, and the rhythms of a Neolithic agricultural community. But from the moment of his birth, the combined psychic weight of thousands of accumulated shaman souls was reshaping his body at the genetic level, granting him an immortality that death itself could not challenge, sealing his soul against any predator that the warp could send against him. And slowly, as he grew, beginning to feed back into his developing consciousness the memories, the knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of every being who had contributed to his making. After the Emperor of mankind had been born, he would not reveal himself for roughly 38,000 years. Part 2. The Hidden God. 38,000 years of watching. Let us pause on that number. 38,000 years. The period of history we consider most relevant to the modern world, the years since the first human cities, since the development of writing and organized agriculture, and all the things we typically mark as the beginning of what we call civilization. It spans roughly 7,000 years. The emperor lived through more than 5 times that span before he ever took the name that history knows him by. Think about what changes in 7,000 years. The languages spoken by every civilization on Earth 7,000 years ago are entirely gone, replaced by languages that those ancient speakers would find completely incomprehensible. The political entities that existed 7,000 years ago have not merely changed. They have ceased to exist so thoroughly that even determining their names requires archaeology. The technology of 7,000 years ago is so distant from the present that displaying it in a museum requires explanation to help modern viewers understand that it was, at the time, sophisticated. 7,000 years is long enough for virtually everything that a civilization is to change beyond recognition. The emperor lived through more than 5 cycles of that, while in different bodies at different times, under different names, in different cultures, wearing different faces. He had not just seen the rise and fall of empires, he had participated in them. He had been in various lives and various guises, the founder, the soldier, the advisor, the opponent, the mourner, and eventually the survivor of civilizations so complete in themselves that the people living within them would have found it genuinely impossible to imagine that the world they knew could ever end. And then it ended, and the emperor moved on. During these 38,000 years, he was not passive. The law is clear that he was not merely watching. He was acting, subtly and carefully, within the constraints imposed by his need for concealment. He guided where he could, where he intervened where intervention seemed necessary and possible without revealing too much of what he was. He used his extraordinary psychic gifts to perceive the long arcs of humanity's development and tried, imperfectly, and with the knowledge that he could not catch every disaster, to nudge the trajectory of his species toward outcomes that would leave them better positioned for what was coming. The most remarkable of the identities that the law attributes to this hidden period is one that comes from the mouth of the emperor himself, in a conversation with Horus during the Great Crusade. The emperor told his war master that he had wept before the river Hyphasis when he thought there were no more worlds to conquer. The river Hyphasis is the boundary reached by Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king who built the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, and who marched his armies from Greece to the borders of India in a campaign of military genius that has never been fully matched in the intervening millennia, and who died at 32 years old, having changed the shape of the world. The image of the emperor, wearing Alexander's face, standing at that distant eastern river and feeling the strange grief of ambition fulfilled and exhausted, is one of the most unexpectedly human moments in all of 40k lore. He was also, as according to various accounts, a nameless warlord in the earliest days of human civilization, a figure who walked the first cities of Sumeria and Mesopotamia, a court advisor in civilizations that have not left enough traces for modern archaeologists to fully identify. He went by many names in those long years. The lore tells us that during the very earliest periods of his existence, when he was still developing his understanding of who and what he was known as Neoth. Later names are scattered through the source material, but most are unconfirmed. What is clear is that he was always moving, always adapting, always maintaining the fiction of being something less than what he was. This required a patience that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Patience, not as a virtue in the ordinary human sense, but as a fundamental psychological condition, as a willingness to watch events unfold that he could see coming but could not prevent without acting in ways that would expose him, a willingness to lose people he cared about repeatedly across lifetime after lifetime, because caring about individuals in a being of his nature and circumstances was an indulgence that had to be constantly managed, a willingness to watch the warp darkening, to feel the chaos gods growing stronger with every passing century, to know that the crisis was coming but not yet, and not yet, and not yet, holding himself in a state of readiness that lasted longer than most species have existed. During all of this, he was also learning. The Emperor's plan for humanity, the plan that would eventually manifest as the Great Crusade and the Webway Project and all the rest of it, was not something he walked into the world with fully formed. It developed over those 38,000 years. He studied the warp with a careful, patient, scientific approach that no other human has ever had the lifespan to apply. He studied the other species of the galaxy, both those he encountered directly and those he could observe from a distance. He learned from the Eldari, who had already built and lost the civilization he was trying to build for humanity. He learned from their mistakes, the specific psychological and spiritual failure modes that had led them from the height of galactic dominance to the catastrophe of the fall. And he was also, during this period, tracking the movements of other forces in the universe. The Old Ones, the ancient alien precursor species that had seeded psychic life across the galaxy and whose conflict with the mechanical Necrons had helped shape the current state of both the galaxy and the warp, were long gone by the time the Emperor was born. But their works remained, and some of those works had implications that the Emperor was uniquely positioned to recognize and understand. The Void Dragon, one of the most powerful surviving shards of the Satan, the star gods who had served the Necrons, was sleeping on Mars. The Emperor knew it was there. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, in an account that reads more like myth than history, the Emperor is said to have fought and imprisoned the dragon beneath the Martian surface, in a confrontation whose scale is difficult to fully envision. Whether this battle is literally true, or represents something more symbolic, the presence of a sleeping Satan shard on Mars would later become one of the factors shaping the relationship between the Emperor and the Adeptus Mechanicus, as the tech priests worshipped what they called the machine god without fully understanding that the machine god might be an imprisoned alien deity that their patron had put there to control. And the galaxy the Emperor was watching and navigating and carefully preparing humanity for was more complicated than any of the histories maintained by the Imperium acknowledge. More ancient, more strange, more full of competing forces with their own agendas and their own timescales. And the Emperor, uniquely, had been watching long enough to understand at least some of those complications in ways that no other human being ever had or could. The moment came, eventually. The age of strife was ending. The warp storms that had isolated the scattered human colonies from each other for thousands of years were beginning to subside. Slaanesh had been born from the collapse of the Aeldari civilization, and while that birth had sent a devastating psychic shockwave across the galaxy, it had also in some ways cleared the air. The four great chaos gods were now all present and defined, which actually made them in certain ways more predictable than the turbulent, half-formed entities they had been during the period of the shaman's decline, and on Terra itself, a shattered world divided among techno-barbarian warlords and gene lords and assorted other power structures born from the chaos of the Age of Strife. The Emperor judged that the conditions were finally right. He emerged. He began to gather his power, and before he could begin the work of unifying Terra and launching the Great Crusade, he made a stop. A stop that changes everything about the story we are about to tell. Part 3. The Warp Gate at Molech. The Price of Creating Gods. There is a world in the galaxy called Molech. In the context of the Horus Heresy, which is to say in the context of the most catastrophic civil war in human history, it is known primarily as the site of a terrible imperial defeat. Horus, the Warmaster traitor, led a massive and well-coordinated assault on the world, overcoming the fierce resistance of its night houses and the imperial forces defending it. The defenders fought with every ounce of skill and courage they possessed, and the world fell anyway. Military historians of the heresy period who have analyzed the Battle of Molech have focused on the strategic aspects, the tactical brilliance of the traitor assault, the tragedy of the night houses who were corrupted or destroyed, the implications for the broader heresy campaign. While most of them have missed the most important thing about Molech, the thing that Horus himself understood, and that drove him to pour significant military resources into taking a world that should not, by purely strategic analysis, have been worth the cost. Molech was important because of something hidden beneath its surface. A warp gate. An actual physical portal into the realm of chaos, and a permanent tear between real space and the immaterial that had been present on Molech for a very long time before the heresy revealed its existence to a wider audience. The entity responsible for the gate's containment, for the careful system of protection and concealment that had kept it from becoming a catastrophic problem, was the Emperor himself. Long before the Unification Wars, long before the Great Crusade, the Emperor traveled to Molech in the company of a small group of perpetuals, those rare immortal humans who shared his ability to survive indefinitely, and he found the gate. He arrived aboard a one-way voidcraft, a detail that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you that he arrived knowing he would not leave the same way he came. He left behind Olivia Soreka, one of his oldest companions, a perpetual woman who had been with him long enough to have a genuine personal history with the being he was, not just the role he played. He left her with specific instructions to guard the gate and, if it was ever threatened in ways she could not manage, to seal it. And then he went through, into the warp, into the domain of the chaos gods themselves. What happened on the other side of that gate is one of the most explosive revelations in all of Horus Heresy lore, a secret whose implications spread outward from a single paragraph in certain source texts to touch virtually every other aspect of the Emperor's story. He met the chaos gods. Not their emissaries, not their demons, not the whispering voices that reach through the cracks in reality to tempt the susceptible. He met them, the actual entities, and there, in the heart of their domain, where the laws of physics are suggestions, and time is a direction rather than a constraint, he negotiated. He made a bargain. The exact terms of this exchange are deliberately obscured in the source material, and this obscurity is itself meaningful. The authors of the Horus Heresy series have been very careful to not give a clean, explicit account of precisely what was promised and what was given. And this careful vagueness reflects both the genuine mystery that surrounds the emperor's inner life and an instinct, probably correct, that the ambiguity is more interesting and more unsettling than any specific account could be. But what is clearly established is the outline. The emperor entered the warp gate seeking specific things, and he needed knowledge. Specifically, he needed the knowledge of how to create the Primarchs. Not just the genetic science, which was within his reach, but the deeper understanding of how to infuse a being with warp energy in a controlled and directed way. How to make a human whose soul carried a fragment of the immaterial in a manner that granted extraordinary power without the corruption that normally accompanies such contact. He emerged from the gate with that knowledge, as he also emerged with something else, some measure of power drawn from the warp itself that enhanced or expanded his already extraordinary abilities. And the entities he had dealt with in that exchange had received whatever it was he had offered them in return. And then he had no intention whatsoever of honoring his end of the deal. This is stated clearly enough in the source material that it is not really speculation. The emperor made a bargain with the chaos gods and then broke it. But he walked out of their domain with their gifts in his hands and his promises behind him, left Olivia Sureka to guard the gate against any attempt to follow up on those unfulfilled promises, and proceeded to use what the chaos gods had given him to begin creating the very beings who would one day lead humanity's armies against chaos across the galaxy. There is a certain audacity to this that is hard not to admire, in a deeply unsettling way. Traveling into the enemy's own domain, yes, extracting what you need from them, and then using what you took to fight them more effectively, all while maintaining the fiction that the deal is still in force long enough to make your escape. It is, from a certain angle, exactly the kind of bold, calculating, ruthlessly efficient move that the character the law builds up around the emperor makes sense for him to make. But the chaos gods did not simply let this go. They were not deceived in any way that prevented them from reacting. They understood what had happened. And their response was not to immediately pursue the emperor with all their power, which would have been the straightforward reaction. Their response was more patient, more subtle, more like Tzeentch in particular tends to operate. They reached into the emperor's laboratory on Terra, where the Primarchs were gestating in their carefully constructed chambers, and they stole them. The Primarchs, those 20 engineered demigods who were supposed to be the emperor's greatest instrument and closest companions and the leaders of his great crusade, were taken from their development chambers and scattered across the galaxy while still infants, dropped onto random worlds, raised in conditions entirely outside the emperor's design. Their characters formed not by the careful cultivation the emperor had intended, but by the raw experience of whatever world they landed on, while whatever parents found them, whatever hardships and joys and tragedies shaped them in the years before the emperor could come and collect them. This matters enormously, because the chaos gods were not merely being petty when they did this. They were playing a very long game. They knew that the Primarchs raised outside the emperor's direct influence would carry within them vulnerabilities that the emperor had not designed into them, as that the worldviews formed by their disparate childhoods would create friction and resentment and ambition and need in ways that could later be exploited. That if the right pressures were applied at the right moments to the right Primarchs, those vulnerabilities could be turned into weapons against the very project the emperor had used their knowledge to create. The heresy was not an accident. It was the chaos gods cashing in on the bargain that the emperor had tried to cheat them out of. Now, this does not mean the emperor was naive about what he was inviting. He is a being who perceives the threads of possible futures with a clarity that approaches actual prophecy. He had to have known, going into the Molech gate, that he was inviting retaliation. He had to have known that cheating beings of infinite patience and infinite cunning meant eventually paying a price. And yet, he chose to do it anyway, because the alternative was going to Molech unarmed, but without the leverage of something to offer, and walking away with nothing. He calculated that the price was acceptable. He calculated wrong, in the end. But the calculation was not irrational. The Primarchs did what he created them to do. The Great Crusade happened. Hundreds of worlds were brought into the Imperium. 1,000,000 years' worth of military glory was compressed into 2 centuries of the most extraordinary expansion in human history. And then the heresy destroyed half of it and changed everything about the trajectory of the Imperium forever. A deal struck with demons at the dawn of time echoed forward through 10,000 years of human history, and the reverberations have still not stopped. Part 4. The Grand Lie That Built an Empire. The Imperial Truth and its Costs. Every citizen of the Imperium of Man who has received any religious education at all knows the basic framework of the Imperial Creed. Why, the Emperor is divine. He is the God Emperor of mankind, the father and protector of the human species, the being around whom all of humanity's hope and survival rightly orbits. His will is made known through the ecclesiarchy. His presence is felt through the astronomicon. His protection is real and active for those who pray sincerely enough, or serve faithfully enough, or fight hard enough in his name. Death in service to the Emperor is not tragedy, but honor. That because the Emperor watches over those who die for him, and his light guides their souls safely through the darkness. This is the theology that the ecclesiarchy has refined and polished over 10,000 years. It is, in its way, a genuinely impressive construction. It accounts for suffering by making it meaningful. It provides a framework within which even the most devastating personal loss can be metabolized as part of a larger divine plan. It gives soldiers a reason to fight, and civilians a reason to endure, and administrators a reason to serve faithfully in positions that offer them nothing except the sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. As systems of mass motivation go, it has proven extraordinarily effective. Here is what the Emperor himself thought of it. He hated it, not with polite discomfort, not with the mild distaste of a private person pressed into a public role, but with principled, sophisticated, deeply considered revulsion. During the period when he was active and present, during the Great Crusade and the unification wars that preceded it, the Emperor did not merely decline to encourage his own worship. He actively suppressed it. He ordered the destruction of temples and the dispersion of cults. He had cities burned because their populations had built monuments to his divinity. He forced entire space marine legions to kneel in the dust, to be lectured about the dangers of the very impulse toward worship that the 41st millennium has elevated into the core of its civilization. The framework through which the Emperor understood all of this is called the Imperial Truth. And the Imperial Truth was, at its core, a declaration that the universe is rational, that gods do not exist, that the entities in the warp, however powerful and however dangerous, are not supernatural beings deserving of worship, but rather alien life forms operating on a different physical substrate than material reality. That human progress comes through science and reason, and the application of knowledge rather than through prayer or faith, or submission to any power beyond the observable. That humanity is capable of understanding and ultimately mastering the universe it inhabits without the crutch of religion. This was not a casual philosophical position, it was a carefully considered policy, enforced with the kind of thoroughness that only an interstellar military empire at the height of its power can manage. Worlds brought into the Imperium during the Great Crusade had their religious institutions removed or reformed. Libraries that contained records of supernatural belief systems were curated and, in some cases, eliminated. The Primarchs themselves were trained within this framework. They're told that the things they sometimes encountered that might seem supernatural, the warp entities, the demons, all of it, were simply alien life forms with unusual properties rather than the dark gods of superstition. The problem, the catastrophic, universe-shaking, heresy-generating problem, is that the Emperor knew it was false.
I want to pause here for a second because I think this part of the lore is genuinely one of the most affecting things in all of Warhammer. I've been sitting with the Emperor's story for a long time now. Not just the battles, not just the lore entries and the codex blurbs, the actual shape of it. A being who spent nearly 40,000 years trying to save his species, who got close, genuinely heartbreakingly close, and then watched it unravel over a choice he made in private that he thought was the right one. That hits different when you stop treating the 41st millennium as a backdrop for cool battles and start treating it as a tragedy. Which is what it is. It has always been what it is. That's why I make these videos, not to recite a wiki, not to actually feel the weight of it. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
He knew the Chaos Gods were real. He had stood in their domain. He had personally negotiated with them, been in the physical presence of entities that are, as in any meaningful cosmological sense, more powerful than anything humanity will ever produce. And he had come away knowing with absolute certainty that they existed, and that they were exactly what the most fearful religious traditions of old Earth had always claimed they were. He had spent 38,000 years watching them grow stronger as human civilization expanded. He had seen the evidence in real time, and of how worship and fear and devotion fed the immaterial entities that fed on psychic energy. He understood, with a precision that no theologian in the ecclesiarchy has ever matched, the exact mechanism by which human religious practice contributed to the power of beings that wanted to destroy humanity. And from this understanding, he built his argument for the imperial truth. If worship feeds the Chaos Gods, then the way to starve them is to eliminate worship. If religious devotion is psychic fuel for the entities in the warp, then a rationalist, atheist humanity that directs its psychic output towards secular rather than religious ends is a safer humanity in a very specific technical sense. The imperial truth was not just philosophy, it was a weapon deployed against the Chaos Gods by the specific mechanism of denying them the ammunition they were accustomed to receiving. The problem with this reasoning, which the disaster of the heresy eventually revealed in the most comprehensive possible way, is that it required the Emperor to maintain a deception about the nature of reality to the very people he was relying on to fight the things he was lying about. The Space Marines of the Great Crusade were told there were no gods, and then sent to fight the servants of gods. But the Primarchs were told the warp was simply another dimension full of strange alien life, and then encountered beings of ancient and deliberate evil, whose nature the imperial truth gave them no framework for understanding. When Horus was shown, through the mechanism of his corruption on the moon of Davin, that the Chaos Gods were real and that his father had known it all along, at the seed of the most catastrophic betrayal in human history was planted in soil that had been carefully prepared by the Emperor's own deliberate deception. Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars, reflected on this after the heresy with a clarity that is almost forensic in its precision. He believed that it was the Emperor's selective sharing of truth, his choice to trust Magnus the Red with certain genuine secrets about the warp while keeping others entirely in the dark, that contributed to the crack in Horus that allowed corruption to take hold. Horus had been told there were no gods. When he discovered there were gods, and that his father had known, the question that formed in his mind was inevitable. If the Emperor had lied about that, what else had he lied about? And once that question forms in the mind of the most powerful, most capable, most loyal, and most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, there is no containing it. The answer came from chaos. He'd whispered and poisonous. He lied about everything. He is not what he claimed. His Imperium is not what he said it was. His love for his sons is not what he demonstrated. None of that was true. But by the time it was being said, the person most capable of refuting it from a position of genuine knowledge was not available to do so. There is also the sheer inconsistency of the imperial truth as actually applied across the Great Crusade, and this inconsistency is itself revealing. But the Space Wolves of Fenris maintained their elaborate mythological framework, a rich spiritual cosmology centered on the Allfather and the great beasts of the world, without meaningful interference from the forces of the imperial truth. Fenris even had a genuine, physical portal to the warp that the local population was aware of and used in the context of their spiritual practice. No cities were burned on Fenris. No libraries were curated into orthodoxy. Here the emperor described Fenris as a charming experiment in reconstructed mythologies, a phrase so dismissive and so revealing about the limits of his actual commitment to the doctrine he was publicly enforcing that it deserves to be examined carefully. The White Scars of Chagoris maintained their own spiritual traditions. The Dark Angels of Caliban operated within a knightly religious framework. Many of the worlds brought into compliance retained significant religious elements in their social fabric, adapted and incorporated rather than eliminated. The aggressive enforcement of the imperial truth seemed to apply primarily to explicit worship of the emperor himself, and to certain particularly visible religious traditions on certain particularly prominent worlds, and to anyone unfortunate enough to be made into an example at the wrong moment. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers became that example. Lorgar, the most spiritually inclined of all the Primarchs, raised in a deeply theocratic culture on his homeworld of Colchis, had built his legion's entire identity around the worship of the Emperor as a divine being. He had written the text that would eventually become the foundation of the Imperial Creed. He had built temples on every world the Word-Bearers brought into compliance. Through the force of his extraordinary conviction and his gift for communicating faith, turned the entire Word-Bearers Legion into missionaries for a religion that the Emperor had officially outlawed. The Emperor's response was to come personally, to bring Malcador, the Sigillite, to order the Ultramarines to destroy Monarchia, the jewel city of the world of Kor that the Word-Bearers had built as a monument to imperial divinity, burning it completely while Lorgar and his legion watched, and then to force the entire legion to kneel in the ruins, while the Emperor explained that they were the only Astartes legion to have failed his purpose. The humiliation was absolute, the pain was real, and the wound it opened in Lorgar's heart was the specific wound that Chaos needed to work on. Not a wound of doubt, because Lorgar's faith was too deep to be shaken by rejection. A wound of betrayal, of being told that the thing he believed most deeply was wrong. Not gently and privately, but publicly and with maximum force. Of being demonstrated before his legion and before the galaxy that his life's work had been declared a failure by the very being he had devoted that life to. Lorgar went looking for gods worthy of his faith. He found them in the Eye of Terror, and what he did next set in motion the chain of events that would break the galaxy. The man who wrote the holy book of the Imperial Creed, the scripture that billions of Imperial citizens will die before they question, was the first great heretic of chaos. The religion of the 41st millennium was founded by the traitor, not the loyal. The Emperor's own deception created the conditions that made this possible. And the cruel irony at the heart of it is that Lorgar was not entirely wrong. He was wrong about which divine beings deserved worship. But the universe does contain divine beings, in the meaningful sense that the Chaos Gods are genuine, real, powerful entities that respond to and are shaped by human devotion. The Emperor knew this, and chose to tell no one. Part 5. The Hidden Project. What was actually being built beneath the palace. The Golden Throne, in the common understanding of the 41st millennium, is the life support machine that keeps the Emperor's ruined body functional, an ancient and irreplaceable piece of technology from the dark age of technology, adapted to maintain the physical vessel of humanity's greatest being in a state of functioning deterioration, while his consciousness powers the Astronomicon and holds back the worst of what the warp wants to do to Terra. It is sacred. It is irreplaceable. Its continued function is the highest priority of the Adeptus Mechanicus's most secret and most specialized divisions. This understanding is correct as far as it goes. But the Golden Throne was not built to be a life support machine, and an understanding what it was actually built for and why the Emperor spent the final decades before the heresy sitting on it rather than leading his great crusade is essential to understanding the full scope of what was lost when the heresy happened. Beneath the surface of Terra, beneath the Imperial Palace and its endless layers of substructures and vaulted chambers, and the ancient machinery of a civilization built on top of an even older civilization, there is a door, enormous, made of a gold-colored alloy that Imperial metallurgy cannot fully characterize. large enough, by the accounts that survive from people who were allowed to stand before it, for a titan to walk through without bowing its head. Behind that door is a tunnel that leads somewhere that is not quite real space and not quite the warp. The tunnel leads into the webway. The webway is one of the most extraordinary constructs in galactic history. Built by the ancient Eldari at the height of their civilization, it is a network of passages and corridors that exists in a carefully partitioned space between physical reality and the immaterial. The walls of the webway are made of a material that the Eldari developed specifically to prevent warp penetration, to maintain a stable, protected environment within the tunnels, even as the warp rages outside them. And traveling through the webway means traveling between stars at speeds that make conventional warp transit look ponderous, without the constant existential threat that normal warp travel carries, without the need for Geller fields or navigators, without the risk of demon incursion or temporal anomaly, or any of the dozen other ways that traveling through the raw warp can kill you. The Eldari used it to hold their civilization together across the entire galaxy. Whole worlds separated by thousands of light years were linked by journeys that took days rather than months. The Eldari Empire was possible because the webway made it possible. The Emperor had spent years studying the Eldari's history. He had followed the arc of their civilization from their golden age through the fall, understanding in detail the specific failure modes that had turned the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced into a collection of traumatized survivors on drifting craft worlds, fleeing or being born from their own collective excess. He had learned from their example in ways that shaped virtually every decision he made about how to build the Imperium, and he had identified the webway as the single most important piece of infrastructure that had ever existed, the key to a form of civilizational unity that could not be achieved any other way. He had found an entry point, hidden beneath the deserts of Central Asia on Terra. Before the Imperial Palace was built above it, the Emperor had discovered a portal into the webway network. An Eldari gate, ancient and intact, leading into the vast labyrinthine dimension that connected the stars. He had spent years studying it, understanding its mechanisms, developing the technology to interface with it at the level of sophistication that his ambitions required. And he had built the Golden Throne as the anchor for a project that he believed could save humanity, not just from the immediate threats of the 41st millennium, but from the fundamental cosmological problem of chaos forever. The plan worked like this. The Emperor, seated on the Golden Throne, would use his psychic will to maintain a protective field around a series of new tunnels being constructed specifically for human use. These tunnels, built by a specially created caste of Mechanicum tech priests called the Unifiers, would be extended gradually through the webway, connecting to the existing Eldari network, eventually linking every world of the Imperium through protected corridors that bypassed the warp entirely. Once this network was established, the Imperium would no longer need warp travel for anything. Ships could move between stars through the webway. Messages could be sent without astropaths and their terrible vulnerability to warp interference. The whole terrifying apparatus of warp transit, with its endless human cost in lives and sanity, and ships simply lost to the vagaries of the immaterial, would become obsolete. And then, once humanity was safely inside the webway, and no longer exposing itself to the warp with every transit between worlds, the Emperor would take the next step. He would use control of humanity's access points to begin suppressing the flow of psychic energy from humanity into the warp. As this suppression became more effective, as less and less human psychic output reached the entities in the immaterial that had been feeding on it for millennia, the Chaos Gods would begin to starve. But not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, and then with accelerating momentum as humanity became progressively more warp-isolated. The ruinous powers, built on the fuel of human emotional and psychic output, would find themselves cut off from that fuel. Over centuries and millennia, they would weaken. While this was happening, humanity itself would continue developing. The psychic awakening that the Emperor could already see beginning in the species but the slow emergence of genuine psychic ability in larger and larger proportions of the population would proceed. But it would proceed in the protected environment of the webway, rather than in the open warp, where every emerging psyker was both a beacon for predators and potential fuel for the chaos gods. Humanity would have time to develop its psychic gifts in relative safety, time to build the social, institutional, and philosophical frameworks to handle those gifts responsibly. Time to become something like what the Aeldari had been at their height, but without the specific hubris and excess that had destroyed them. A psychic species, genuinely, not the half-developed, poorly understood, largely feared and persecuted psychic minority that the 41st millennium represents, but a species where psychic ability was genuinely integrated into what it meant to be human. This was the end point. This was what the Emperor was actually building. Not the military empire that the Great Crusade created, which was always meant to be the first step of a much longer process. Not the Imperium of the 41st millennium with its endless grinding wars and daily human sacrifices and institutional paranoia about everything that cannot be fully controlled. An actual golden age. A genuine civilizational achievement that would have made everything that preceded it, and including the suffering of the heresy and the horror of the age of strife, and all the terrible things humanity had endured over 38,000 years, part of the price paid to get here. Nobody was told. Not the Primarchs, who resented deeply and understandably being left behind, while the Emperor retreated to his palace for what appeared to them to be reasons he refused to explain. Not the High Lords, not the Navigator Guilds, though the Emperor's reasoning here, that they would violently resist a project that would render their monopoly on interstellar travel worthless, has some logic to it, even if it does not justify the level of secrecy maintained. Not even the Custodian Guard, who spent years fighting and dying in the webway's tunnels without knowing why they were there. The secrecy was the Emperor's chosen approach, and one can construct a defense of that choice. The Chaos Gods, if they knew what he was building, would have moved against it with everything they had. The Aeldari, if they knew humanity was trying to claim the webway network for its own use, would likely have opposed it through whatever means they had available. The Navigator Guilds, as noted, had every reason to fight it. The project required conditions of secrecy to have any hope of completion. But the secrecy also meant that when Magnus the Red, desperate to warn his father of the heresy's coming, had made the terrible mistake of forcing his psychic projection through the wards around the Imperial Palace, there was no one who knew what he was destroying. Magnus did not know what he was destroying. He knew only that his father needed warning and that the fastest way to deliver it was directly. He had no idea that the intricate psychic shielding he was punching through was the only thing protecting the human-built sections of the webway from the warp. Was no idea that the breach he created in those shields would open gates that demons were already pressing against from the other side. The flood that poured through the breach was immediate and overwhelming. The war within the webway, that desperate, largely unknown engagement fought by the Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence in the tunnels beneath the palace, while the main events of the heresy played out above them, was the consequence. Hundreds of custodians died in those tunnels, of fighting forces that they were never entirely equipped to face, buying time that turned out to be insufficient. The webway project was destroyed, not damaged, not set back, destroyed. The human-built sections of the network were lost, the portal was breached, and the Emperor was forced onto the Golden Throne permanently, not as part of his plan, but because the alternative was a demonic flood pouring directly into Terra. The Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is the Imperium that results from the Webway project failing, the daily sacrifice of psychers to maintain the Astronomicon, the reliance on warp travel with all its associated horror, the stunted, feared, persecuted state of psychic humanity rather than the integrated, powerful, protected psychic civilization that should have been developing for the last 10,000 years. All of it. All. Every single aspect of the grinding nightmare that the 41st millennium represents is the direct consequence of Magnus the Red trying to save his father, and destroying the thing his father was building to save them all. Part 6. The Dark King. How close he came. There is a prophecy, old enough to predate the Imperium, referenced in the dreams of Ealdari Farseers and the fragmented visions of human seers across centuries of recorded history that describes a fifth chaos god. Or not Khorne, or Tzeentch, or Nurgle, or Slaanesh. Something else. Something born from the darkness at the heart of humanity's own nature. The cold and terrible face of a species that has decided that survival justifies every cost, and that the individual lives consumed in service to that survival are simply fuel. The entity in the prophecy is called the Dark King. The Elder had been warning about it for a long time. The vague shape of the thing, even before its emergence, but was disturbing enough to draw the attention of beings who had watched the Chaos Gods since before humanity learned to write. Something was coming from humanity. Not yet, not fully formed, but the potential was there, sitting in the psychic space that humanity occupied, waiting for the conditions that would cause it to crystallize. Most people in the Horus Heresy era who encountered this prophecy assumed, reasonably enough, that the Dark King was going to be Horus. But the War Master was certainly trending in a direction consistent with the description. The Chaos Gods had poured their combined attention and power into corrupting him. He was, by the time of the Siege of Terror, carrying within his mortal form a level of warp power that was genuinely incompatible with continued physical existence. And the kind of entity that would be left behind when that power eventually consumed the man it was riding was the kind of entity that the Dark King prophecy could plausibly describe. But it was not Horus, it was the Emperor. This is the secret that lives inside the Terminus Decree, the document kept by the Grey Knights that authorizes them to end the Emperor should he ever leave the throne in any form whatsoever. It is the thing that explains why even the Grey Knights, yet the most loyal and most capable servants of the Imperium, are maintained as a potential check against the Emperor himself. Because the Dark King prophecy did not resolve when the Emperor chose not to become the Dark King. It was delayed. The potential still exists, and the throne is the thing that keeps it contained. In the final stages of the Siege of Terror, as Horus stood at the culmination of his corruption aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor faced a problem that had no good solution. Horus, saturated with the combined power of the 4 Chaos Gods, was stronger than the Emperor could match with his own reserves. The Emperor had spent years trapped on the Golden Throne, fighting the demonic flood in the webway, his physical and psychic resources depleted by the sustained effort in ways that he had not fully recovered from. He needed more power. He needed it immediately, and there was only one place to get it fast enough: up the warp. He began to drink from the immaterial with a speed and scale that was genuinely unprecedented. Not the careful, measured use of warp power that he had always maintained before. Not the kind of controlled contact that kept a psyker on the right side of the line between using the warp and being used by it. A desperate, total immersion in the psychic energy of the immaterial, consuming it at a rate that began almost immediately to change him in ways that he could feel happening and that he chose to continue despite feeling them. The entities of the warp, sensing what was happening, did not intervene to stop it. They accelerated it. The Chaos Gods understood, in the strange non-linear way that beings existing outside normal time can understand things, that this was the moment the prophecy described, that the Emperor, draining the warp to fight Horus, was the trigger that would birth the Dark King if allowed to proceed. They were not horrified by this prospect. A 5th Chaos God, even one born from humanity's rationalism and cold purpose, rather than from its traditional excesses, was still a Chaos God, still something that would exist in their domain and add its power to the perpetual churn of the immaterial, even if it was also something they would have to compete with. The dark entity forming around the Emperor as he consumed the warp was described, by those sensitive enough to perceive it, as a force of merciless judgment, sublime fury, cruel rationality, a being that did not embody humanity's rage or grief or hope or despair, the things that feed the four chaos gods we know, but something harder and more clinical. The god of necessary evil, the god of acceptable costs. The god that forms when a civilization decides that the mathematics of survival always wins over the mathematics of individual human worth, and that this decision is not a tragedy, but simply the rational conclusion. The emperor, ascending into the Dark King, was not becoming a being of corruption in the conventional sense. He was becoming the purest, most complete expression of the logic that had already shaped his decisions for millennia. The logic that said the plan matters more than any individual who serves it. That secrecy is necessary even when it costs lives and relationships and the trust of the people closest to you. That the end justifies the means because the end is survival and the means are whatever they need to be. And he was stopped, not by a primarch, not by any custodian or warrior of the Imperium or being of great power, by Olanius person, as a man the emperor had known for longer than most of the primarchs had existed. An ordinary human being in the most technical sense possible, though one who shared the emperor's immortality through the perpetual gift. A man who had fought beside the emperor in wars so old that no record of them survives anywhere. A man who knew him not as the emperor of mankind, but as a person. Not as a symbol, but as an individual. That person stepped in front of the ascending Dark King and did the only thing available to him. He reminded the emperor of who he was, not in argument, not in theological debate or strategic analysis, but in the weight of direct personal connection. The two of them, in the midst of the most terrible moment of the most terrible war in human history, had a conversation that the law describes only in its effects rather than its content. Because what matters is not what was said, but what happened when it was said. The emperor stopped. He released the power he had accumulated. He stepped back from the edge of becoming the Dark King. He chose to face Horus as himself, diminished and uncertain, rather than as a chaos god, guaranteed to destroy his corrupted son, but at the cost of destroying everything else as well. That choice is the most human thing the emperor ever did, not the 38,000 years of patient planning, or not the scale of ambition that could conceive of the Webway project, but the specific, costly, entirely rational choice to remain human at the precise moment when becoming something else was both possible and would have solved the immediate problem. He beat Horus, barely. His body was destroyed in the process, and the Dark King prophecy was not resolved. It was deferred. The potential that had almost crystallized in the moments before Person's intervention did not dissipate. It settled back into the emperor on the throne, contained by the machine, waiting. The Terminus decree exists because the people closest to the emperor's legacy understand that the Dark King is still in there. That 10,000 years of being worshipped as a god, of having the psychic output of 1 trillion human beings directed toward him in devotion and prayer, of accumulating the warp energy that human faith generates and that the warp interprets as belief power, has been building something. The question the Terminus decree asks is not whether the emperor coming off the throne would be a good thing. It is whether whatever comes off the throne would still be the emperor. Let us sit with that for a moment longer, because it is one of the most disturbing implications in the entire setting, and it tends to get glossed over by the louder drama of the heresy and the siege itself. Every day, for 10,000 years, the citizens of the Imperium have prayed to the emperor. Not metaphorically, not in the abstract sense of reflecting on his legacy, actively, devotionally, with the kind of sincere faith that generates genuine psychic resonance in the warp. There are approximately 1 trillion human beings in the Imperium at any given time in the 41st millennium, and while a significant fraction of them are too busy surviving to pray every day, the sheer volume of consistent, institutionally encouraged, a deeply emotionally sincere devotional energy directed toward the Emperor across 10 millennia is a psychic output that the warp cannot simply absorb without something forming around it. The Chaos Gods are defined by this principle. Horn exists because so much rage and violence and martial pride has accumulated in the warp over so many billions of years that it crystallized into something that is now an entity rather than merely an emotion. Slaanesh came into being when the psychic resonance of the Eldari civilization finally reached a critical mass and precipitated catastrophe. The warp turns belief and emotion and desire and fear into things when there is enough of those things in sufficient concentration over a sufficient period of time. This is not disputed. It is the fundamental operating principle of the immaterial, as the setting describes it. The Emperor has had 1 trillion people praying to him for 10,000 years. Whatever that psychic output is doing in the warp, it has not simply been dissipating harmlessly. It has been accumulating around the consciousness of a being who is already one of the most powerful psychic entities in human history. The Emperor, contained within the throne, has been the focal point of an amount of devotional warp energy that might be comparable to what the Chaos Gods were built from. It has been pouring into him and around him and building in the space the warp reserves for entities of his kind. The Dark King potential does not require a dramatic ascending moment to manifest. It does not require a second siege of terror or a second confrontation with chaos-enhanced enemies. It may already be happening slowly, the accumulated psychic output of 1 trillion believers, gradually, incrementally, one day at a time, doing what the warp does with sufficient accumulated intent and power, forming something, building something around the consciousness on the throne that may or may not still be recognizable as the Emperor by the time it is finished. The Terminus Decree was written with foresight about this possibility. The Grey Knights who hold it do not speak about it publicly, as the details of what it actually authorizes have never been published in any imperial document available outside the most classified archives. But those who study the history of the organization, who read the gaps between the words in the rare accounts that do survive, understand that the scope of what it permits is not small. If the Emperor attempts to leave the throne in any physical form, if a being claiming to be the Emperor emerges from the Golden Throne under its own power and begins to act in the material world, the Terminus Decree authorizes measures against it. The specific language reportedly includes the phrase that was apparently quite deliberate and was apparently quite difficult to write, whatever it is. Not whatever he is. Whatever it is. The people who drafted the Terminus Decree were not certain that the Emperor they were protecting against was the same entity as the Emperor they were serving. They covered both possibilities by using language that did not presuppose identity. There is also this, which is worth noting carefully. The Dark King prophecy, as the Eldari understood it, described a being of cold rationality and merciless judgment, not a being of rage or pleasure or entropy or scheming, and a being that makes the calculations that other beings cannot make and then acts on those calculations without flinching. A god of necessary cost, a god of the kind of logic that says 1 billion lives is an acceptable price to save 2 billion lives, and that anyone who disagrees simply lacks the strength to do the mathematics. The Emperor already thought in these terms. Across 38,000 years of experience and planning, and his framework for evaluating decisions was already the framework the Dark King prophecy describes. The Dark God would not be a corruption of his nature, it would be an amplification of it. The thing he was already inclined to be, given the power of a true warp entity, and stripped of whatever remaining constraints his human origins still imposed on his judgment. Whether that version of him would be good for humanity in the cosmic sense, or whether a god of pure, ruthless optimization pointed at human survival would be better or worse than the current arrangement, is a question the law has the wisdom to leave open. The answer is probably that it depends enormously on what the optimization function actually is, whether the version of human survival it would pursue is one that most humans would recognize as worth the name, and whether a being defined by the logic of acceptable costs would ever classify the costs being paid as unacceptable. Those are not reassuring questions to be left open. Part 7. What lives in the throne? Now, the truth behind the divine aura. The Sisters of Silence are perhaps the most philosophically unsettling part of the Emperor's institutional family. These warrior women, the null maidens who serve alongside the custodian guard, are psychic blanks. The warp does not touch them. More precisely, they are negative space in the psychic landscape, voids in the great flowing sea of consciousness that surrounds all living things. Where a psyker is a bright point in the immaterial, casting light and attention and shadow, a sister of silence is an absence, a place where the light simply is not. This gift makes them extraordinarily effective fighters against warp-based threats. Because demons that rely on psychic senses to perceive the world around them find sisters of silence effectively invisible. But it also means that they see the world differently from everyone else. The psychic fog that surrounds most beings, the unconscious projection of psychic energy that adds emotional and spiritual dimensions to perception, is absent for them. They see things stripped of their psychic resonance, clean, unaugmented by any immaterial color. A sister of silence named Caria Kazrin was present in the chambers of the Golden Throne during the war within the Webway, in the years before the heresy reached its climax. She was there performing her duty, one of the Silent Sisterhood maintaining a human psychic firebreak against the demonic incursion pressing from the other side of the Webway gate. And she looked at the Emperor as he sat upon the throne. No golden halo, no radiant corona of divine light, and no emanation of sacred power or overwhelming psychic presence. He wore his armor, the golden plate that has become iconic in every representation of him in the 41st millennium. But she saw what was inside the armor, a man, human in shape and proportion, sitting in visible agony at the effort of maintaining the psychic shielding around the Webway tunnels, and fighting the demonic incursion and doing everything else he was doing simultaneously, aging a face that had not aged in thousands of years. His mouth open in a silent scream. Just a man, in terrible pain, doing an impossible thing because no one else could do it. This is the truth beneath the story. The God Emperor of mankind, the divine being whose will spans the galaxy and whose protection shields 1 trillion souls. It is experienced differently depending on who is doing the experiencing. For most humans, even custodians who have spent their entire lives in his proximity, his psychic projection creates an overwhelming sense of divine presence. The golden light is real, in the sense that his mind generates it automatically. The psychic emanation of a being of his power is such that it shapes the perception of everyone around him. For a blank, for someone with no psychic sensitivity at all, those emanations have no effect, and what is left, stripped of the projection, is exactly what Caria Kazrin saw. A man, in pain, working. Now consider what that man has been doing for 10,000 years. His body does not function in any meaningful biological sense. It does not breathe or metabolize or circulate or do any of the things that biological processes require. It is maintained in a state that might charitably be described as preserved decay by the mechanisms of the Golden Throne, which are themselves failing, and by the constant influx of psychic energy extracted from human psychers at the cost of those psychers' lives. The officially maintained figure is 1,000 psychers per day. Documentation from the late 41st millennium indicates this figure has been rising steadily as the throne's condition deteriorates, with some estimates suggesting 4 times that number may currently be required to maintain anything approaching optimal function. As the mathematics of this are worth sitting with for a moment. 1,000 human lives per day, 365,000 per year, 3.5 million per decade. Across 10,000 years, the number of human beings who have been brought to terror by the black ships and burned away to fuel the Emperor's continuance climbs into the billions. Each of those people had a life before the black ship came. A family probably, friends certainly, while hopes and fears and small ordinary joys and the specific texture of an individual existence that is irreplaceable when it ends. They became fuel, not because they chose to, not because they understood what was happening to them, but because the Imperium decided that the Emperor's continuance was worth that price, and acted on that decision indefinitely. And this has been happening in service of a being whose consciousness is probably no longer fully coherent. The novel Inquisition War, But one of the oldest accounts of what the emperor actually is, in his current state, suggests that by the 38th millennium, his personality had already fragmented. That different aspects of what he was were operating semi-independently, some manifesting through the phenomenon of living saints, some through the rare moments of direct imperial intervention in galactic events, some through the whispered guidance that astropaths and navigators occasionally perceive in the currents of the immaterial. Whether this represents a distributed but still fundamentally unified consciousness, or something genuinely more disturbing, a fracturing that is slowly producing multiple incompatible entities where one being once existed, is one of the great unresolved questions of the setting. What is certain is that the throne itself cannot last indefinitely. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who have spent 10,000 years studying it and who have a religious motivation to understand it that borders on existential, admit in their most private technical documents that they cannot repair it. Not that repairs are difficult or expensive or require resources they have not yet located. They cannot repair it because they do not fully understand it. The Golden Throne is technology so advanced that it exists beyond the current maximum of human comprehension, inbuilt during an age so far before the present, that the conceptual tools necessary to understand how it works were lost when the dark age of technology ended. If the throne fails completely, the consequences cascade through everything simultaneously. The webway gate beneath the imperial palace, held shut for 10,000 years by the emperor's will, opens. The demonic forces that have been pressing against it since the war within the webway are still there, still pressing, still waiting. They pour out into terror. The most important and most heavily defended world in the galaxy becomes the staging ground for a demonic incursion of a scale that has no precedent in recorded history. At the same moment, the Astronomicon goes dark. The psychic lighthouse that has guided Imperial ships through the warp for 10 millennia, the signal that navigators rely on to determine their position in the immaterial, the fixed point around which all of interstellar civilization is organized, simply stops. Ships in transit at that moment are lost. Worlds that depend on regular resupply from other worlds are cut off. The supply chains of a million-world civilization, all of which assume the Astronomicon will continue to function as it always has, fail simultaneously. The terminus decrees most extreme provisions, the ones that authorize the destruction of the entire imperial palace and potentially terror itself, rather than allowing the forces of chaos to claim the throne world. So reflect an understanding that if the throne fails under the wrong circumstances, the best possible outcome may be denying the enemy a prize rather than anything resembling survival. Let us talk about what it actually means to live in an Imperium built on this foundation. Not the abstract, theological version. The daily operational reality. The administratum knows the throne is failing, not suspects. Knows. The technical reports exist. The Adeptus Mechanicus has filed them. Yet the data on the increasing energy demands of the life support systems is documented and has been documented for centuries, showing a clear and unambiguous trend line that continues in only one direction. The High Lords of Terror receive this information. They review it in formal session. They acknowledge its implications in internal memos that are classified at levels so extreme that the existence of the classification tier itself is classified. And then they continue with their institutional responsibilities, because the alternative to continuing is acknowledging that there is no good outcome here, and that the entire edifice of imperial civilization is pointed toward a wall that it cannot stop moving toward. This is a kind of collective psychological management that is difficult to overstate. The senior leadership of the most powerful human civilization in history has organized its entire institutional culture around not looking directly at the thing that is going to end it. The administratum processes the paperwork. The Inquisition purges the threats. The Space Marines fight the wars. The ecclesiarchy offers the prayers. Yet, and all of it happens against a background reality that everyone at the highest levels knows, and that the institutional structure is explicitly designed to prevent anyone from discussing honestly. The black ships represent the clearest visible evidence of this architecture of necessary ignorance. They arrive at worlds throughout the Imperium on regular schedules, collected by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, authorized by Imperial law. They are staffed by people who understand at least the functional purpose of what they do. Psychers are identified, collected, transported to Terra. Their gift, which in most cases manifested in their ordinary life as nothing more than a slight sensitivity to others' emotions or an occasional vision of things that had not happened yet, becomes the mechanism of their destruction. Most of them believe, because they have been told, that their service to the Emperor is an honor, that their sacrifice will be redeemed by the continuation of the divine will they are sustaining. Some of them go to the processional with genuine peace, having internalized the story fully enough that their death within it feels meaningful and chosen even when it is neither. The story is doing exactly what the story is supposed to do, which is make this arrangement feel acceptable from the inside. From the outside, having all the information. What the black ships represent is a civilization so thoroughly dependent on a failing machine that it is feeding human beings into that machine on a mass industrial scale, and has been doing so continuously for 10,000 years, with the rate of consumption increasing as the machine's efficiency decreases, with no solution in sight. But with the eventual outcome of all this maintenance being either the continued slow deterioration of the machine until it finally stops regardless, or a catastrophic failure event that makes everything the machine was built to prevent happen all at once. There is a passage in an older version of the law, not widely discussed, yet in which a senior Adeptus Mechanicus representative essentially admits to an inquisitorial contact that they have not actually been trying to repair the Golden Throne so much as document it. That the technical complexity is far enough beyond current capabilities that meaningful repair work is not currently possible, and that the documentation project, the accumulation of detailed records of how the device functions, but is the prerequisite for any eventual actual repair rather than a substitute for it. They have been studying the problem for 10,000 years. They are not close. The existential weight of that admission is the kind of thing that breaks institutional cultures if it propagates too widely, which is probably why it appears only in the very obscure corners of the law rather than the mainstream accounts. The Adeptus Mechanicus is organized around the sacred duty of maintaining and recovering human technology. The Golden Throne is the most important piece of technology in the Imperium, and the best that 10,000 years of the most devoted technical minds in the human species has produced is a detailed set of notes about how it works that remain insufficient to actually fix it. The Custodian Guard, as the 300 warrior monks of the Adeptus Custodes, who stand eternal watch at the foot of the throne and throughout the imperial palace, carry in their institutional culture a weight that no external description quite captures. They were created by the Emperor personally. Each one was shaped by his direct intervention, every gene line and enhancement calibrated by a mind that understood what he was building and why. As they were not made for the wars of conquest that the Great Crusade required. They were made to protect him specifically, to be his personal household, the tip of the spear that only he himself was meant to wield. For 10,000 years, they have not been able to perform that function. The thing they were built to protect cannot be protected by anything they can do. They stand watch over a machine. They repel intruders from the palace, and they perform their ceremonial duties with the perfect dignity that centuries of practice have refined. But the Emperor they were made for, the being they were specifically built to stand beside in battle, is inaccessible to them. He has been inaccessible since the Siege of Terra. The relationship between the custodians and the Emperor that their creator intended never came to exist, because by the time they were needed in the way they were designed to be needed, he was on the throne and would never come off it. The grief in that institutional reality is not something the custodians express openly. They are not built for open expression. But it is present in the architecture of their purpose, in the gap between what they were made to do and what they actually do, and in the way that every custodian who has ever stood watch at the throne has spent that watch in the presence of a being they were built to protect and been unable to protect him from the thing that is actually destroying him, which is time. and entropy, and the slow, unstoppable failure of a machine that was always going to outlast its maker's ability to sustain it. Chapter Part 8: The Star Child and the Sensei. Secrets within secrets. There is a layer of this story that most lore discussions skip over, partly because it draws on some of the oldest and most obscure corners of the source material, and partly because it involves ideas so strange that even within the context of Warhammer 40k, they read as genuinely unexpected. But it is also one of the most emotionally resonant aspects of the entire Emperor story, because it is about children. Oh, and about the parts of the Emperor's history that were never written into any official doctrine. The Emperor lived as a man for 38,000 years. A man with extraordinary gifts, yes, and purposes that extended far beyond the ordinary, but still fundamentally a person, experiencing life from the inside rather than directing it from some comfortable external position. He loved people. Across those 38,000 years, he formed genuine connections. The specific kind of connection that happens when you are embedded in a community and sharing life with individuals who matter to you. And sometimes those connections produced children, not the Primarchs. The Primarchs were deliberate, engineered, created with specific purpose, using techniques that involved the warp and the knowledge extracted from Molech. They are superhuman by design, shaped to serve a particular function, while the children the Emperor fathered in his hidden years were simply children, born in the ordinary way, to women he cared about enough to be present for, growing up as ordinary people with no particular awareness of what their father was. These children were different from ordinary people, though the difference did not manifest in the ways the Emperor's own gifts did. His daughters, by all accounts that survive, were powerful psychers. The psychic gift that defined their father ran in them, diluted across the generation gap but still present, and sometimes very strong. They lived normal human lifespans. They grew old and died as people do, carrying within them a trace of something extraordinary that most of them probably never fully understood or never knew how to contextualize. His sons were something else entirely. The sons of the Emperor were born as psychic nulls. As not just ordinary people with no psychic ability, but something more extreme than that. Beings who cast no shadow in the warp at all. Where a blank, an ordinary untouchable, is simply a person who generates a negative psychic aura that makes warp-sensitive beings uncomfortable. The Emperor's sons were perfect voids. They could not be perceived through the warp at all. Not tracked, not sensed, not touched by any demonic influence, not reached through any psychic means. They existed in a gap in the immaterial, as complete as the gap left by someone who had never existed at all. And they did not age. Like their father, they were immortal. Their bodies refused to accumulate the damage of time, simply continuing, unchanged, for as long as nothing external ended them. These immortal, null, wandering sons are called the sensei in the oldest corners of the lore. They have spent their existence, centuries, and in some cases millennia of it, not knowing what they are. Yet they simply know that they are different, that the years pass, and they do not change. That psychically sensitive people sometimes respond to their presence with inexplicable unease. That they need to keep moving, need to not stay in one place long enough for the unchanging face to become too conspicuous, need to keep reinventing themselves as each community around them grows old and notices that one person among them has not. The Emperor himself cannot see them. They are blanks, yet they are invisible to him in precisely the way that the Sisters of Silence are invisible to warp-sensitive beings. His own children, the living proof of his humanity across the millennia, the evidence that whatever extraordinary thing he is, he was also always capable of love and connection, and the creation of life in the most ordinary and the most profound sense, are beyond his perception entirely. There is an organization, hidden within the already labyrinthine structures of imperial society, as that knows about the sensei. In the oldest lore they are called the Illuminati, individuals who have learned, through various terrible means, that the source material declines to fully specify, the truths about the Emperor and the Chaos Gods that the official apparatus of the Imperium suppresses. former members of inquisitorial teams who encountered evidence they could not unsee, former possessees of chaos entities who somehow expelled their demon and came away knowing too much, and as scholars who found documents that should have been burned. People, in other words, who are now burdened with understanding that has no safe home anywhere in the official Imperium. The Illuminati have been gathering the sensei where they can find them, protecting them, and preparing for what they believe is the final act of the Emperor's story. They believe that the Emperor's soul, adrift in the warp across 10,000 years since the heresy, has been slowly reconsolidating. That at the core of what made him who he was, the humanity and the compassion that he deliberately severed from himself when he needed to face Horus without hesitation, the part that he intended to reclaim afterward and never could because afterward he was on the throne and could not act freely, has been forming in the immaterial as a distinct entity. They call this entity the Star Child. The Star Child is not the Emperor as he was. It is something more essential. Was the Emperor's humanity distilled into something that can exist in the warp without being consumed, building itself slowly across millennia in the same way that the shamans once slowly accumulated power in the immaterial between their incarnations, waiting for the conditions of its birth to be met. The Illuminati believe that if all of the sensei can be gathered, and if they can be sacrificed at the precise moment of the Emperor's physical death, their combined soul energy, mixed with the waiting Star Child in the warp, would create a rebirth. The Emperor, reconstituted from the most essential elements of himself, freed from the constraints of a failing body and a failing throne, would emerge as something genuinely new, something capable of taking a different approach to humanity's protection, capable of completing in some form the plan that the heresy interrupted, capable of being present in ways that the throne has prevented for 10,000 years. The echo of the original shaman conclave in this plan is not lost on those who know enough to see it. Thousands of souls sacrificed simultaneously, creating a new being of extraordinary power to guide humanity forward. The cycle proposing to repeat itself. Whether this represents a genuine solution or simply a different version of the same trap is a question the law does not answer, and probably never fully will. There are those who believe the Star Child is not the Emperor's compassion reconsolidating. There are those who believe it is Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and manipulation, the architect of fate, wearing the most convincing disguise the galaxy has ever seen, and playing a game whose patience makes the 10,000 years of the current Imperium look like an afternoon. Tzeentch is, after all, the entity most capable of this kind of deception, yet most motivated by the chaotic possibilities that would be unleashed by a genuine or false imperial rebirth, and most likely to have been monitoring the Emperor's situation closely enough to identify this particular vulnerability. If the Illuminati's plan is a Tzeentchian plot, and if the sensei are sacrificed in good faith toward an entity that is not what they believe it is, the results would be difficult to calculate and probably difficult to survive. And this is the kind of uncertainty that the oldest corners of the lore are extraordinarily comfortable with, and that most newer Warhammer 40k storytelling tends to move away from. The Starchild material is not a recent addition. It dates to the Rogue Trader era, to the very earliest attempts to map the cosmological structure of this setting. And the people who wrote it were apparently comfortable with the idea that the most important question about the Emperor's future, whether he can be reborn as something genuinely new, was probably not going to have a clean answer, which is honest in a way that a lot of fictional cosmologies are not. Most stories that set up the question of a dying god's potential rebirth eventually provide the resolution. Either the rebirth happens and the story about what comes next begins, or the rebirth fails and the story about what that failure means unfolds. Warhammer 40k has spent several decades sitting with the question suspended. The Illuminati's plan still in motion, the sensei still being gathered, the Star Child still forming or not forming in the warp depending on which sources you credit, and the outcome still genuinely uncertain. The effect of this sustained uncertainty on the setting is interesting to think about. The Emperor's story does not have an ending because the universe does not have an ending. The grimdark is not a narrative with a climax to be resolved and a denouement to be lived through. It is a condition. It continues. The question of whether the Emperor will be reborn into something capable of changing the condition is exactly the kind of question that a universe defined by its continuance rather than its conclusion leaves deliberately and permanently open. What the Star Child material does, even in its suspended, never quite resolved state, is complicate the theology of the imperial faith in a specific way. The Ecclesiarchy's doctrine holds that the Emperor is a god who is currently maintaining his divine protection across the galaxy from the throne. The Star Child theory holds that what the throne contains is no longer really the Emperor in any meaningful sense, that his essential self has already departed into the warp, that the machine is sustaining a biological remnant while the actual person has been reforming in the immaterial for millennia. If the second version is true, then the prayers of the Ecclesiarchy are going somewhere, but not to the place the Ecclesiarchy intends. The devotional energy of 1 trillion believers is reaching the warp. It is almost certainly affecting the warp in ways that correspond to the scale of the input. But whether it is reaching the Star Child, or feeding the Dark King potential, or being absorbed and redirected by entities entirely unrelated to the Emperor, is a question that the official doctrine of the imperial faith is not equipped to even ask, let alone answer. The Sisters of Silence would see through any answer offered, of course. They would see a building, an institution, a very large number of people behaving in very specific ways, organized around an absence. An elaborate and sincerely maintained structure whose center is a gap. In the emperor-shaped void, at the heart of imperial religion, is something that people who cannot perceive psychic projection see clearly, and that people who can perceive it tend to fill in with the projection itself, rather than acknowledging that the projection is covering something they cannot actually examine. This is, on reflection, exactly how all religious frameworks function. And they are structures built around experiences and certainties that are not fully communicable in the language of ordinary empirical observation, and the question of whether the experience corresponds to a real external entity or represents something generated by the human capacity for meaning-making and psychic sensitivity is one that most religions have no good epistemological tools for answering. Well, Warhammer 40,000 is unusual in that it gives those questions a genuine cosmological structure and then populates that structure with entities that are genuinely ambiguous about whether they exist for humanity's benefit or its exploitation. The sensei themselves, the immortal null children wandering through the centuries without understanding what they are or why they persist, are perhaps the most human element of the entire Emperor's story. Not human in the sense of ordinary, unremarkable, a small-scale existence, but human in the sense of being genuinely lost. They did not ask for immortality. They did not choose to be blanks. They did not volunteer for the role that the Illuminati's plan has assigned them. They are simply people who wake up every few decades and realize, again, that everyone they knew has gotten old and died, and they have not, and who have no framework for understanding this, except the inadequate ones available to them in whatever culture and era they currently inhabit. Some of them are probably fine. Some of them have managed the extended existence with something approaching equanimity, found communities that could accommodate their difference, built lives that felt meaningful despite the disconnection that immortality imposes. Some of them have probably gone badly, as the centuries of loss and recurring displacement accumulating into something that the human psyche was not built to carry indefinitely. Most of them, in the absence of any external guidance about what they are, have simply tried to survive and have remained confused about the fundamental nature of their own existence for as long as they have existed. The Illuminati finding them is, from one angle, a rescue. On someone finally explaining what you are and why you are is a form of gift, even when the explanation is accompanied by the news that you are prophetically destined to be sacrificed. At least the sacrificial role is a context. At least it is a framework for understanding the accumulated centuries. The sensei who join the Illuminati and accept the plan presumably prefer the terrible clarity of knowing to the merely terrible confusion of not knowing. Whether they are right to prefer it depends on whether the Star Child theory is correct, whether the Illuminati are themselves deceived, and whether the sacrifice of their accumulated centuries of continuous existence will produce the thing the plan promises, or the thing that Tzeentch, if this is a Tzeentchian construct, has always intended it to produce instead. These are questions the universe of Warhammer 40k will probably never answer cleanly, but they are the right questions to be asking. And asking them is how you understand what this setting is actually about, under all the skulls and bolters and dramatic Latin. Part 9. Why the truth would break everything. We have now assembled the pieces. Let us put them together in the specific configuration that answers the question that is the title of this video. What would happen to the Imperium of man if all of this were broadly known? Not known to the Inquisition, not known to the High Lords, not known to the specialized agencies that already maintain some fraction of it in classified form, known to everyone, to the billions of ordinary citizens on ordinary worlds who go to their churches and say their prayers and mean them, who tell their children that the Emperor watches over them and believe it, who have organized their entire moral and psychological and communal existence around the image of the God Emperor and the story of his divine sacrifice and his ongoing protection. Start with the origin. The Emperor is not divine. He is not descended from any cosmic power beyond humanity or touched by any force outside the human. He is a construction, deliberately engineered by a group of ancient human psychers who performed mass ritual suicide because they could see no other way to give their species a fighting chance against the growing darkness of the warp. He is human in the most essential sense, built from human components, is carrying human souls forward in accumulated form, shaped by human hands toward human purposes. The cosmic origin. The idea that a power greater than humanity chose the human species for a special destiny and sent them a guardian of divine nature collapses immediately into the far more mundane and far more honest story of a bunch of very old and very frightened people doing the only thing they could think of before the last lights went out. This alone destroys the ecclesiarchy as an institution. That not damages it, not weakens it, destroys it. The entire structural authority of the Adeptus Ministorum is premised on the Emperor being a god. Every decree, every inquisition, every institution of religious control, every bishop and cardinal and missionary and battle sister derives their authority from the claim to speak for a divine being. If the Emperor is not divine, they do not speak for a god. Their authority dissolves. The holy decrees become the documented opinions of a very old, a very powerful, very private man who made decisions he thought were good for humanity, not the sacred commandments of the divine carried through time by sanctified servants. The billions of citizens who have structured their entire inner lives around this religious framework are not merely disillusioned. They are orphaned. The meaning-making framework through which they understood their suffering. Yet the belief that the Emperor sees them and cares for them, and that dying in his service connects them to something transcendent, that framework dissolves. What remains when the framework is gone is just the suffering. Without the story to make it meaningful, without the divine context to give the grief and loss and daily grinding difficulty of life in the Imperium some larger purpose, the weight of it simply exists, naked and unmediated. Then the Molech revelation hits. The Primarchs, and the genetic grandparents of every space marine who has ever lived, existed because their creator descended into the domain of the Chaos Gods and came back with knowledge that the Chaos Gods chose to give him. The creatures that every space marine is trained from birth to fight, to hate, to resist, to destroy, are the entities whose knowledge is embedded in the foundational law of every chapter's genetic heritage. The pride of lineage that Space Marine chapters maintain with fierce devotion, as the honor rolls and the heraldry and the 1,000-year traditions of loyalty to a particular Primarch's legacy, all of it rests on a foundation that includes a deal with the enemy. Then, the Imperial truth. The revelation that the Emperor knew the Chaos Gods were real and chose to propagate the opposite as official doctrine, opens a wound in the Imperium's self-understanding that cannot be closed. Because the Imperial truth was not just a philosophical position, It was enforced through violence. As cities were burned, worlds were sanctioned. Men and women were killed for maintaining religious practices that the emperor had declared incompatible with his vision of a rational humanity. All of that violence, all of that institutional trauma, all of that suppression of human spiritual life was done in service of a policy that the man implementing it knew to be false. You cannot recover from that revelation. You cannot find a comfortable accommodation with the knowledge that the founding lie of your civilization was known to be false by the person who made it mandatory. Then, the webway. What might have been. What was within reach. What the 41st millennium was supposed to be before Magnus the Red destroyed the possibility of it while trying to prevent the heresy that destroyed everything else. The image of what was lost, of the golden age that was almost built, of the humanity that could have existed instead of the humanity that does, is not a comfort. It is an indictment. It demonstrates that the hell of the current Imperium was not inevitable. It was the consequence of decisions that could have been made differently, of secrecy that could have been abandoned, of trust that could have been extended to the sons and servants who would have died to protect the Webway project if only they had known what it was. Then the Dark King. The knowledge that the being they worship almost became a chaos god during the siege that founded the Imperium, that the only thing preventing this was a personal conversation between two old friends in the middle of the most apocalyptic battle in human history, that the potential for the Emperor to become something worse than chaos is not historical curiosity, but an active concern managed by a standing order to the Grey Knights to kill him if necessary. Yet the Imperium that bases its psychological stability on the Emperor being the unconquerable champion of order needs to metabolize the knowledge that he was, for a moment, something else. And that moment, technically, never fully resolved. And finally, the throne, failing, irreparable, maintained daily by the sacrifice of people who do not understand what is happening to them, supporting a consciousness that is probably fragmented and certainly not what it was. Yet with a demonic flood on the other side of a gate that the Emperor's will is the only thing holding closed, waiting for the moment that will is insufficient. The Imperium is not built on strength. It is not built on the absolute military power of its armies, or the administrative sophistication of its institutions, or the technological capability of its forge worlds. It is built on the willingness of its citizens to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep accepting the cost of existence within its structure, because the alternative, the void beyond the Imperium, seems worse. That willingness is sustained by the story. Take away the story, and you do not have a wounded Imperium. You have the raw components of one, full of competing interests and institutional rivalries and local power structures that have always been managed by the existence of a shared, unquestionable divine authority. Without that authority, the competing interests compete with nothing to arbitrate between them. The High Lords of Terror become what they actually are without the Emperor's divine legitimacy, a collection of powerful individuals with no shared purpose, except the ones they can negotiate among themselves, which historically has not gone particularly well for anyone outside the room. Consider the specific cascading effects more carefully, because the chain of collapse is not just about belief. It is about power structures that have been using belief as their primary enforcement mechanism for 10,000 years. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the militant orders of the ecclesiarchy are among the most fanatically dedicated warriors in the Imperium. Their combat effectiveness, the thing that makes them genuinely terrifying on the battlefield, is inseparable from their faith. They fight with the kind of ferocity that only belief in something absolute produces, the absolute that what they are doing is righteous and that death in its service is meaningful. Take the foundation of that faith away, reveal that the God they serve is not a god, but a very old and very complicated human being whose divine nature was always a necessary fiction, and you have done something to the Sisters of Battle that no enemy in 10 millennia of warfare has managed to accomplish. You have given them a reason to stop fighting. This is not a small thing. Yet the Adepta Sororitas fields multiple armies across dozens of combat theatres at any given time. The militant orders represent a significant fraction of the Imperium's organized military force in certain sectors. If you hollow out the faith that sustains their combat effectiveness, you do not simply lose some theological certainty. You lose those armies at the moment you are trying to hold together everything else that the revelation is simultaneously breaking. As the Space Marines present a different but equally serious complication. The revelation about the Primarchs, about the Molech bargain, would not break Space Marine chapters in the way it breaks the ecclesiarchy. Space Marines are not primarily motivated by religious faith in the devotional sense. They are motivated by chapter pride, by brotherhood, by the specific traditions and identity of the organization they were forged in. A Space Marine of the Ultramarines fights for Ultramar, and for Guilliman's legacy, and for the specific culture of excellence and service that his chapter represents. His faith in the Emperor is real, but it is not the same thing as an ordinary citizen's faith. What the Primarch revelation does to Space Marine chapters is more subtle and in some ways more damaging than outright destruction of belief. It introduces doubt about the purity of lineage, about the gene seed that defines a Space Marine's identity, that connects him genetically and spiritually to the Primarch who established his chapter's founding traditions, comes from a being who was created using knowledge obtained from the Chaos Gods. The monsters at the heart of every chapter's founding myth are threaded into the very source of that chapter's existence at a biological level. Most Space Marines would probably not be broken by this information. They are not, on the whole, given to existential crisis in the way that ordinary humans are. But the information would propagate through chapter cultures and change the texture of what it means to identify with a chapter's legacy, and the downstream effects of that change on morale, on the certainty of purpose that sustains combat effectiveness, on the philosophical framework within which Space Marines understand their own nature, are not nothing. And then there is the Inquisition, which represents the third pillar of the Imperium's enforcement structure alongside the ecclesiarchy and the Space Marines. The Inquisition's authority derives ultimately from the mandate it was given by the Emperor to protect humanity from within. Its license to do anything, to sacrifice any number of people, to destroy any world that has become a liability, to override any institutional authority in pursuit of its remit. Is predicated on the idea that this mandate comes from a divine source and is therefore not subject to ordinary evaluation by ordinary moral standards. If the mandate comes not from a god, but from a very old, very private man who died 10,000 years ago and whose current condition makes it impossible to verify that he still endorses anything the Inquisition does, then the Inquisition is not the voice of a divine will. And it is an extraordinarily powerful organization operating under an authorization that has not been renewed since before any currently living human was born. The distinction matters because the Inquisition's authority is the thing that allows it to burn planets. That specific power, the ability to sanction an exterminatus against a world containing billions of human lives, is not something that can be justified by institutional efficiency or military necessity alone, as it requires a moral framework that elevates some considerations above the value of billions of lives, and in the Imperium's case, that framework is the divine mandate. Without the divine mandate, what the Inquisition does when it orders an exterminatus is order the destruction of billions of human beings. Full stop. The justifications that make that action comprehensible and bearable to everyone involved dissolve. This does not mean the Inquisition stops existing. It means the Inquisition becomes an organization defined by the raw exercise of power, rather than by the legitimate exercise of divine authority. And organizations defined by raw power behave differently from organizations defined by legitimate authority. They become more nakedly coercive. They attract different kinds of people. The institutional culture shifts in directions that are not improvements, but the things that have always been done in the Inquisition's name, but which have always been justified by the divine mandate, become things done purely because the Inquisition has the power to do them, and no one has yet developed the capacity to stop it. That is a darker Imperium than the current one, which is saying something genuinely remarkable about the scale of the darkness already present. Now add the timeline element, the knowledge that the Golden Throne is failing, or that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot repair it, that the increasing energy demands are documented and trending in one direction only, that the most optimistic technical assessments of how long it can continue to function are not measured in millennia, that the people at the top of the Imperium's institutional structure know all of this and have no solution. For most human civilizations, in most circumstances, knowledge that the civilization is on a clock does not immediately cause collapse, and people are capable of living with uncertain timelines, with knowledge that things will eventually be worse, with the awareness that the present arrangement is unsustainable if viewed from a long enough perspective. What they are not good at is living with the knowledge that the symbolic anchor that has organized their entire understanding of their civilization's permanence and divine protection was always temporary and is approaching its conclusion, and that nobody in authority has anything resembling a plan. The story of the Emperor protects the Imperium partly by making the Imperium feel necessary, righteous, and permanent. An institution whose divine founder still watches over it from his golden throne. He still extends his protection across the galaxy, still maintains the Astronomicon and the psychic web that makes interstellar civilization possible. An institution like that feels like it deserves to persist. It feels like the universe has assigned it a purpose. Take that away and replace it with the actual story, the story of a very old man whose body is failing in a machine his engineers cannot fix, whose divine protection is actually a slowly degrading biological process, whose continuation requires thousands of human sacrifices every single day, whose purpose for the throne he sits on was never meant to be what it became. And the Imperium feels like what it actually is. Something that should have ended better, but did not. And human beings do not maintain civilizations that they believe should have ended better, but did not. They maintain civilizations that they believe deserve to continue. The story is not incidental to the Imperium's continuation. It is the mechanism of its continuation. This is why the truths are suppressed not as a matter of political convenience, but as a matter of genuine institutional survival. The Imperium's leadership, the people who actually know some or all of these things, are not cynically manipulating a credulous population for personal power. They are, many of them, genuinely convinced that the suppression of these truths is the single most important act of service they can perform for humanity. They may not even be wrong. That is the most uncomfortable thing of all. The argument for keeping the secrets is not a weak one. An Imperium where everyone knows the truth is not obviously better than the current one. It might be worse. The chaos of disillusionment, the collapse of the institutional frameworks that the shared story sustains, the wars that would follow the removal of the divine authority that keeps the High Lords nominally aligned, might produce a death toll that dwarfs the cost of the secrets being kept. The people who burn the libraries to protect the lies are not all villains. Some of them are people who understand the fragility of what they are protecting and who have made a genuine calculation that the fragility justifies the burning. This does not make the burning right, but it makes it comprehensible. And in a universe that prides itself on everything being terrible in multiple directions at once, yet comprehensible is as close to nuance as you usually get. Part 10. The Eternal Vigil. What remains when the story is known. And yet, hold that and try to sit with it honestly. Because there is something that resists the simple conclusion that the Emperor was simply wrong, that the Imperium is simply bad, that the truth cleanly vindicates any particular critique or any particular alternative. He was trying to save humanity, not abstractly, not as a vague expression of goodwill toward a species he happened to be a part of, but in the literal, practical sense of attempting to construct conditions in which the human species could survive the cosmological threats facing it. He understood those threats more clearly than any other being of his kind has ever understood them. He had the perspective, accumulated across 38,000 years of patient observation, to see the long arc of what was coming and to think about it seriously. The Webway project was not a fantasy. It was a genuine, achievable, beautifully conceived plan for a genuinely better future. He made mistakes, serious ones. The decision to keep the Webway project secret contributed directly to its destruction. Yet the decision to enforce the imperial truth selectively and hypocritically created the specific emotional conditions that allowed Lorgar's corruption to take hold and become the seed of the heresy. The bargain at Molech, however necessary it seemed at the time, handed the Chaos Gods the leverage they needed to scatter the Primarchs and set in motion the betrayals that would come. Every major failure in his plan connects back to a decision he made, and a calculation that seemed correct at the time and proved insufficient against the complexity of the universe he was trying to navigate. But the alternative is not clearly better. The Chaos Gods, if the Emperor had not existed, would not have been restrained by anything. The entities forming in the warp during the Shaman's time would have matured into fully powered ruinous powers, with no opposing force of anywhere near comparable magnitude. Humanity, whereas without the Primarchs and the Space Marines and the institutional framework the Emperor built, would have encountered the age of strife and the coming of chaos with no particular means of surviving them. The elder races had already demonstrated that high civilization was not automatically a protection against the warp. The Emperor, with all his flaws and all his failures, was still the closest thing the galaxy has to a counterbalance against forces that otherwise have no counterbalance. And this is the tragedy at the center of the Emperor's story. Not that he was evil, not that he was secretly working against humanity's interests all along, but that he was genuinely, sincerely, with everything he had, and across more years than most civilizations have existed, trying to do something that was almost impossibly difficult, and he came close enough to succeeding that the failure is genuinely heartbreaking rather than simply inevitable. The shamans who made him knew they were not creating a god. They knew they were creating a human being with more than human capacity, and they knew that might not be enough. And they did it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing. In some ways, it was enough. In others, it was not. The conversation about which category the 41st millennium falls into does not have a clean answer. The Emperor sits on his throne. The machine around him ages and deteriorates in ways that cannot be stopped. Somewhere in the warp, a consciousness that may or may not still be coherent as a unified thing continues, whatever it is doing in that dark sea. 1,000 people per day are burned away to maintain the current state of affairs, which everyone who understands it knows cannot be maintained indefinitely. The Grey Knights hold the terminus decree and wait for the moment that will never come at the right time. And across 1,000,000 worlds, in vaulted cathedrals and mud-floored simple shrines and chapels bolted to the hull of starships and foxholes, carved into the ground while waiting for the enemy, billions of human beings look at the best symbolic expression they have of the thing that is keeping them alive and say the only thing that makes sense to say. The Emperor protects, and perhaps, in the limited and imperfect and deeply human way that was always the only way available to him, bound by circumstances that were partly of his own making and partly imposed on him by a universe that did not want him to succeed, he does. Not because he is omniscient, not because he is divine, not because any prayer offered to him is heard in the way the person offering it understands hearing, but because the echoes of what he built, even shattered and distorted and filtered through 10,000 years of institutional distortion into something he would probably not recognize, are still somehow sufficient to keep humanity fighting when fighting seems completely pointless. That is not nothing. In the specific context of the 41st millennium, where everything is terrible and hope is the rarest resource in the galaxy, that is actually quite a lot. The real truth about the Emperor, the one that sits beneath even the truths we have been discussing today, is this. He was trying to do something that has never been done. Yet he was trying to guide a species through a developmental transition that has already destroyed the only other civilization advanced enough to attempt it. The Aeldari built a high civilization, generated the psychic resonance that civilization's excesses produced, created a god with that resonance, and were nearly annihilated by the god they made. The emperor watched that happen, understood what it meant, and spent 38,000 years trying to construct conditions in which humanity would not repeat the same mistake. He was not afraid of human potential. He was not trying to limit humanity or keep it small. The Webway project, the creation of the Primarchs, the Great Crusade itself, all of these were moves in a plan that was trying to get humanity safely to the other side of a transition that the warp makes essentially guaranteed to be catastrophically dangerous. But he wanted humanity to become fully psychic. He wanted the warp and the material to reconcile rather than be at perpetual war. He wanted a galaxy in which the Chaos Gods were starved of the worship and fear that sustained them, not because they would simply vanish, but because they would diminish to a scale where a fully evolved humanity could manage them rather than simply running from them. That is a breathtaking ambition, even knowing how it failed. Even sitting in the wreckage of the 41st Millennium and tracing every disaster back to the choices that produced it, the ambition is remarkable. He was not trying to build an empire, he was trying to build a species. The Imperium was a staging ground, a mechanism for consolidating humanity long enough to attempt the next step. The Golden Throne was never supposed to be a permanent address, yet the Emperor was supposed to open the Webway and then step off the throne and walk into the new era alongside the people he had built it for. That plan died when Magnus tore the hole. It died in the specific, irreversible way that things die when a single catastrophic event destroys a condition that cannot be recreated. The Webway project required years of uninterrupted work by the most powerful psychic mind in human history, focused entirely on the task, shielded from external disruption. Magnus's warning, offered in love and desperation, was the rock through the window that could not be unthrown. The Emperor's response, the punishment of Prospero, was the reaction of a man who had just watched decades of work and the best chance humanity had ever had get destroyed by someone who should have known better and did not. His rage at Magnus was not the rage of a god affronted by disobedience. Yes, it was the rage of an architect whose life's work was destroyed by the well-intentioned carelessness of someone he had trusted. It was proportionate to the loss in the interior sense, even when it was catastrophically disproportionate in the exterior one. It was human, which is both the most charitable and the most accurate thing you can say about it. The Primarchs, those 20 extraordinary beings the Emperor created and scattered and recovered and trusted and watched fall, were his most personal investment in the plan. Each of them carried a piece of his vision, a specific angle of what a fully realized human being could be and do, a living argument for the potential that humanity was carrying inside it waiting to be unlocked. He loved them in the complicated way that a person who has spent thousands of years learning not to form attachments eventually forms attachments anyway, which is to say, deeply and not quite openly, and with a vulnerability that his public persona was entirely structured to conceal. He did not tell them everything. This was his failure with them. The failure was not in the ambition that made them what they were, and it was not in the pride that kept their origins at Molech classified from them. It was in the assumption that they did not need to know what he knew to become what they needed to be. That the plan could work if the people inside it were shielded from the full context. That secrecy was a form of protection rather than a form of abandonment. What Horus felt when he finally understood that the man he had given everything for had withheld the one piece of information that would have made all of his service comprehensible was not primarily rage. It was grief. The Chaos Gods found that grief and worked in it. Yes, expanding it carefully the way water expands in a crack in stone and eventually shatters it. But the crack was the grief first. The grief was real before the Chaos Gods touched it. Horus had been abandoned with incomplete information and then left to discover the incompleteness in the worst possible circumstances. The betrayal he felt was genuine, even though the Emperor had not intended it as betrayal. This is the tragedy in its most refined form. Two people who cared about each other deeply, separated by a communication failure that neither of them was fully responsible for. one of them too committed to secrecy, and the other too proud to ask the questions that might have broken the secrecy, ending in the most destructive possible collision. The heresy was a family catastrophe scaled to cosmic proportions, and it happened because the Emperor, for all his 38,000 years, and all his extraordinary power and all his meticulous planning, as was still at some level a person navigating a relationship without the skills the relationship required. He could plan for the chaos gods, he could build the webway and breed the primarchs and hold together a coalition of 20 demigods and 1,000,000 worlds through sheer force of personality and vision. He could not quite figure out how to tell his son the truth before the truth became a weapon in someone else's hands. That is recognizably human. Frustratingly, heartbreakingly, completely recognizably human. The truth about the Emperor would destroy the Imperium. The story about the Emperor keeps it alive. And the real tragedy, the one that sits at the bottom of all of this, when you look at it long enough, is that both of those things are probably true at the same time. And there is no version of events in which that stops being the tension at the heart of everything. He was a man who tried to make a better world. The world he made is terrible. And somehow, impossibly, that terrible world might be the only reason his species still exists. Hold that. Sit with it. That is Warhammer 40,000. The 41st Millennium does not offer clean resolutions. It offers wars without endings, and sacrifices without acknowledgement, and truths that cannot be spoken, and lies that cannot be abandoned, and people, billions and billions of ordinary people, trying to live decent lives inside a structure that was never designed with their welfare as the primary concern. As it offers everything terrible at once and asks you to keep going anyway. Not because it gets better, not because the ending justifies the journey, but because the alternative to keeping going is not the peace you are hoping for. It is just a different kind of terrible. The Emperor understood this better than anyone. He kept going for 38,000 years before the heresy. He has kept going for 10,000 years since. His reasons have shifted, and his methods have failed, and the plan he was executing is no longer executable in any meaningful sense. But whatever is left of the consciousness on the throne, whatever fragment of the man who walked among humanity for 48,000 years, and cared enough about its survival to spend every moment of those years trying to secure it, that fragment has not let go. There is something to be said for that. Not as religious truth, not as divine mandate. It's just as a human fact about a human being who was more than human and tried to be good and did not fully succeed and kept trying anyway. He was always one of us. That was always the point. That was, I think, always the thing he wanted the story to preserve, rather than the divine nature the story substituted for it. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this video gave you something to think about, if it pulled you deeper into a setting that rewards exactly this kind of long, slow, careful looking, please leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it tells me that this kind of dive is worth doing and worth doing well. And if you want more of this, more of the deep lore, the hidden history, the truths that the Imperium burns libraries to suppress, subscribe to Q on 40k. This is what we do here. We go slow. We go deep. We take the grimdark seriously, and we try to understand it rather than just admire how grim and dark it is. The Emperor's truth is still out there, as buried beneath 10,000 years of very motivated suppression. We are going to keep looking for it together. Until next time, rest well, and for whatever it is worth, in whatever limited and imperfect way is available to any of us in a universe this vast and this old and this unrelentingly difficult, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.